I'm doing well.
Okay.
I'm Bob Wright, as you know.
Do I get introduced too? Or just
you get introduced too, but I was going to elaborate on my own, biography.
But I thought you didn't need introduction.
I was born to a poor family in Oklahoma. No. I'm from Blogging Heads TV. That's me. Who are you?
I'm Jim Pinkerton, a fellow with the New America Foundation, contributor to Fox News, former advisor to various Republican presidential campaigns.
Most recently, Mike Huckabee.
Yes.
Now, remind me, did he wind up getting the nomination?
He came in second.
Oh, did he?
He came in a strong second, and plenty of people have said to me since that he could be stronger on the ticket than McCain. But what do you do?
There are certainly people who think coming in second gets you as close to the White House as coming in first is going to have gotten you. But I personally am too superstitious to assume that Barack Obama is going to win. By the way, do you? I don't even know. I vaguely assumed you were a McCain guy now, but he's kind of a wild card for a Republican, and you're kind of a wild card for a Republican
I'm a
yourself.
Republican, so I put it this way: I think that I was strongly for Mike Huckabee. I thought that if Mike Huckabee were the nominee right now, he'd be much better positioned to address a lot of these domestic economic issues. Much more able to point fingers where they belong, both in the Bush administration and the Democrats in Congress. And I think that McCain has been sort of done a poor job of articulating, the causes for this financial meltdown. And the voters, therefore, assume it's Bush's fault, and therefore, if it's Bush's fault, they assume it's McCain's fault.
Yeah, Huckabee was lambasting Wall Street before it was cool.
He was, and he was talking about the middle class and the struggling middle class. When everybody else in the running for the nomination in 2008 was sort of reciting Republican National Committee talking points.
Yeah. If we have time at the end, I might actually want to talk to you a little about this prospect of kind of party realignment in the wake of all this, because the coalitional lines are getting kind of confusing. But maybe we should start out with something you suggested. You said you didn't want to do kind of standard campaign analysis, and you're right, there's plenty of that going around. You wanted to look into your crystal ball, and I guess I'm supposed to look into mine and talk about what it would look like. Well, you said a year into an Obama administration. I said I'm too superstitious to assume that's what we're going to see. So I'd like to do it both with an Obama administration and a McCain administration.
Fair enough. We can take Senator Biden as our guide to this. What did he say so famously?
There's going to be a international crisis within the first 3 months. I didn't hear exactly his quote.
I think he said 6 months. And I think that's exactly right. And I think, by the way, it would apply to any new president. And it doesn't even take a crystal ball to say that in a yeasty world, something will happen. Something big. And so I guess I'll just go first, and we should actually do the opposite. I'll talk about Obama, and you talk about McCain. How's that?
Okay.
It's in this first 6 months of an Obama presidency, he's going to face. I can think of three or four crises right off the bat. One is, what do you do about Iraq? It is not at all clear to me that the Iraqi government is going to sign this deal on the troop status by the end of this year, which would legally invalidate American presence there in Iraq. Now, I don't think this is meaningful as it sounds. The American troops aren't about to leave no matter what, but we're going to, President Obama is going to, the hypothetical President Obama would face, the severe challenge of keeping his promise or not, and I assume he would try, of beginning the substantial withdrawal of American troops in a chaotic situation. In addition, and I just curious as an American and as an observer, does he really mean it when he says that he is going to escalate the American presence in Afghanistan and do much more ambitious, muscular undertakings to try and eradicate the Taliban from Pakistan?
Yeah.
I just puzzle over whether all these college kids and liberals and so on who hate Bush and hate McCain and love Obama really understand that they signed on to a John F. Kennedy-esque agenda in the Middle East of expanding a war into another country. Now, I mean, it may be a harsh way of putting it, but that seems to be what the Obama campaign platform is, and I just wonder, how that'll play, and most obviously, Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the kind of perversities that the campaign dynamics have led to. Obama trying to out-hawk McCain on Afghanistan, and McCain and Palin trying to outdove Obama on the question of trying to take out terrorists in Pakistan without Pakistan's permission, right?
Right.
And I gotta say, I am attributing almost all of it to campaign dynamics, and pretty much none of it to like which advisors have Obama's ear, right? I mean, I don't think this speaks to which foreign policy advisors have his ear. I think it speaks to which campaign advisors have his ear, and I think with any politician it would be a mistake to underestimate the malleability they may exhibit once in office. So,
well, you're not suggesting that President Obama would flip-flop, are you?
I think I am.
All right, okay.
I think, and I think I'm going to go further and suggest that he's a politician. Let's just go crazy here, okay? But I don't know. I mean, the thing is, it's a pretty specific pledge to escalate in Afghanistan. You know, often foreign policy rhetoric during the campaign is something you're not held accountable to, if only because it's so vague or it's hypothetical. But that's a pretty specific pledge, so it's not trivially easy for him to back out of. But part of my disappointment at the campaign dialogue has been that nobody has brought up the question of whether we're really sure it's in America's interests to really up the throttle in Afghanistan, and whether we're really sure that will wind up tamping down the terrorist threat there. I mean, I genuinely do not know. I don't know. But I do know that if every, fifth aerial strike winds up taking out, civilians or a wedding or something, and a certain percentage of them invariably does, it's not totally clear that on balance you're helping the cause of reducing, sympathy for terrorists in the region. And it's disappointing that hasn't gotten aired.
Right, I agree, but I'll go further and they'll say they might well tell President Obama, look, if you don't do something drastic, we're going to lose in Afghanistan. The status quo is not an option. Doesn't mean they'll be storming Kabul and killing Karzai, although I suspect Karzai is always one well placed IED away from ending the whole government there. The political advisors around Obama, the same people who created this, as you say, perverse system where Obama's the hawk and McCain's the dove on Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, will say, listen, do you really want to go into the 2010 midterms having lost a war? No. Okay, well then you got to keep going past that, don't you? And then you really want to run for re-election in 2012 having lost a war or two? And the answer might well be no. And this leads to the great legend of the 1960s, which is that John F. Kennedy was telling all his liberal advisors what they wanted to hear, which is, oh yeah, we'll pull out of Vietnam. Don't worry, as soon as they get reelected in '64. Mm-hmm. And the number of people who claim to have heard Kennedy say that keeps expanding. As the Vietnam War became less popular. But who knows? I mean, it's what Kennedy would have done, because he was killed obviously a year before the 64 election. So who knows what Obama would do during the course of his presidency on that issue?
Yeah. In contrast, we think it's pretty safe to say that McCain would escalate in Afghanistan as soon as feasible, given the commitment of troops to Iraq, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, McCain, curious enough, has been kind of quiet on Afghanistan.
Well, but partly because he's in this weird tactical position of pretending to be more dovish, or I don't know. Again, I wonder if that isn't campaign rhetoric. I mean, he hasn't denied that he's going to go in and fight Afghanistan all the way, right?
Well, I mean, again, it's a question as to what's feasible and what's doable. I mean, in the same spirit of the campaign advisors are one thing and White House advisors are another thing. I mean, at some point, and I think, Bob, you and I ultimately agree on this issue, you sort of have to sort of reasonably conclude, is America accomplishing anything in a sort of an ethnic war between, the Pashtuns in the south and the Northern Alliance in the north, where we picked the Northern Alliance and they sort of took over, and the Pashtuns, who are basically Pakistanis, have deep resources inside Pakistan. Now, how exactly do you win a war like that? I mean, I think the history of counterinsurgency is you never win a war if the insurgents have access to a border with a friendly country, whether it's North Vietnam or Afghanistan. So something tells me that, and of course the irony is, and I'm not willing to predict McCain would do this, is McCain would have the credibility to say, look, we won, damn it, my friends, in Afghanistan, and now we're leaving. We have made a deal with the Saudi Arabians, we've made a deal with the whoever's, and now we're out of here. And that actually wouldn't surprise me that much if he were to do that, in an Eisenhower, Korea kind of way.
Well, he's so hard to predict because, I mean, as I said before, he almost does, he doesn't have policy ideas so much as policy moods. I mean, he is just a kind of, maybe impulsive is an oversimplification of the way he makes decisions, but this is McCain, I mean, but he's tough to predict. But in general, he's been on an interventionist jag for about a decade and a half and spent the previous decade and a half in a highly non-interventionist mode. So I gotta, I don't know. So you're seeing, I mean, in a way the question here is, McCain is said to be surrounded by both neocons and realists, right?
Right.
And the question is, you're saying which one wins the struggle for his soul?
Right, and then the question is the economic situation so fearsome that we just can't afford to take these kind of undertakings that we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, presidents have a lot of power on foreign policy and a lot of unilateral latitude, which actually makes it very tempting for them to want to do foreign policy because it's frankly more fun than wrangling around with the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee over a tax bill or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But look, we're in a pretty serious situation economically, and the spending $10 or $15 billion a month in these foreign wars may get kind of taxing, no pun intended.
Yeah. Where I think you might see a difference, if you look at some other dimensions of the kind of war on terror, I think you might see a more predictable difference between Obama and McCain. Maybe, I don't know. But I'm thinking in the realm of nuclear non-proliferation and, various multilateral devices for discouraging proliferation. I mean, for example, McCain voted against the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the ratification of that in the waning years of the Clinton administration, I guess. I'm sure Obama would be for that.
Yeah.
And in general, I would think Obama would be to the left of McCain on arms control.
Yeah, I mean, Obama keeps saying, I think this is a terrible mistake, that he wants to eliminate the weaponization of space, which is a nice enough thought, I suppose, unless, of course, the Chinese and the Indians and everybody else's, the Russians, and the Japanese intend just the opposite. I mean, this is a case where the rap on Obama, or at least one of the raps on Obama, is that he's basically some, lefty. And I think the last few decades have been very hard on the left in terms of, its utopian visions for world peace and brotherhood and so on. And
hey, careful. I got where's my United Nations flag? It's just around here somewhere.
I mean, as we know, the Nonzero thesis has been pretty much, thrown out the window.
Not true? Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you. Do I owe you money for being my book publicist, Jim? Thank you. What Nonzero says is either we establish the institutions of international governance that would stave off chaos or we descend into chaos. It does not. It does not predict a rosy future, and it specifically highlights, although written before 9/11, the grave peril posed by the intersection of grassroots hatred and resentment on the one hand, and weapons of mass destruction on the other.
Okay, but I mean, how about even something as basic as, can the European Union, as a microcosm of the world order, agree on a climate change policy? And the answer is no, they can't.
Well, look, if they don't, then I'm telling you, my prediction in the book is totally can't lose. If they don't, then things get worse and worse, and I'm right. And if they do, then things get better and better, and I'm right.
Okay, but I mean, why bother writing the book then if it's not going to happen?
Oh, I haven't given up yet. Look, I'll tell you, if Al Gore had been president when 9/11 happened, he might well have used the political energy unleashed by 9/11 to do exactly what I would have liked to have seen.
Well,
that's a total possibility.
I've never had occasion in recent years to think positively about my vote for Bush in 2000, but wow.
But now you're thinking
world government. Wow, I mean,
you're thinking chaos would be a lot better. Than
look, I think that any world government would be the sheen of order hiding in the facade of order, hiding chaos behind the scenes. And I can't think of anything less viable than Hu Jintao and Vladimir Putin and Robert Mugabe and the United States trying to haggle out a deal on anything. I'll take Thomas Hobbes every time.
I'd like to go back to the part of your sentence before the phrase sheen of order, Jim. The phrase world government. I don't use the phrase world government. I use phrases like global governance and so on. I'm not imagining like one person in charge, because I doubt they would have the wisdom to appoint you, in which case I do not want the power concentrated in one person's hands. And I really mean that I'm talking, you think you definitely want to strive for decentralization whenever possible in transnational governance. But, this leads us, we were going to talk about the economy a little, and maybe this is a good segue, because...
Because you got to get off this topic fast, I understand. Yeah.
No, I'm happy to go on. Go ahead. We're talking about my book. I can't get enough of it. Bring it on. Bring it on. Go ahead.
I mean, I just think this issue, as Darwin said, all systems evolve towards complexity. The world is not moving toward any kind of, linked order on things. It's moving the opposite way. The Muslims, the people who want to bring Sharia law to the world, and hopefully they won't get past their own zone, they're not interested in what we think. I think that all this world government stuff is a reflection of the American victory in World War II, which thought maybe it could be done on American terms. And if I could dictate a world government on American terms to the rest of the world, I might even do it. But if I thought the rest of the world could dictate their form of government onto me and to us, I'd be reaching for my Colt 45 right now. And I don't mean the beer, I mean the gun.
The Colt 45, as I recall, was not strictly speaking a beer. It was a malt liquor, Jim. There's a difference. One gets you drunk faster.
I'd be looking for ways to fight back, not for ways to drink away my concerns.
Okay, I took your point, even as I corrected you. So do you deny that over the last few decades there in fact has been a trend toward transnational governance, both at the regional level, as with the European Union, and at the global level?
I think it's a blip.
Well,
I think there's some stuff that you can agree on. You can agree on time zones and things like that. But I think that the things you can agree on are vastly greater than the things you can't agree on. And again, as I repeat, I think that the world government came in two ways: one after World War I and one after World War II. And both of them were artifacts of the good wishes and and many of them admirable people.
Thank you.
Naive.
Thank you.
Like Albert Einstein or Eleanor Roosevelt or whoever, who just could never, who assumed, as Einstein said, that nationalism was the measles of mankind, and that we would somehow overcome that through reason and rationality and secularism and so on. And I just think that the last 20 or 30 years have been a pretty stinging repudiation of that. to the point where the European Union now is on. I think it's going to come asunder. It might have been feasible to bring France and Germany and the Benelux countries into some little economic union or something like that. But when you get to Greece and Finland and Estonia and Ireland, it's just absurd.
Well, first of all, that thing about France and Germany, you certainly would not have said in 1946. I mean, to quote a line from a book you only minutes ago treated in a somewhat critical fashion, if in 1946 you had said, look, in half a century, France and Germany will have the same currency, the reply would have been, oh, really, which nation will have conquered which? No one would have imagined then that the European nations would peacefully integrate to an extent where they had a common currency. And now, if you look at what's happened in the wake of this economic crisis, what people started saying is, look, the trouble with Europe is actually the Fed doesn't have as much power as the American Fed, and they made up for that by getting together and coordinating their policies on this like capitalization of banks and so on, and it worked. So you saw a kind of ad hoc transnational governance work in keeping with the view expressed in the aforementioned book that to the extent that the expanse of economic integration grows, the expanse of governance has to some extent grow if things are going to work well. And in fact, you also saw transatlantic coordination with us, in effect, following Europeans' lead and doing the bank capitalization thing. And it was that overall harmony of policy to which was attributed the seeming, at least temporary, staving off of out-and-out economic Armageddon.
Okay, and in the past there have been plenty of international agreements and international arrangements and so on. I mean, all the 19th century was full of agreements on trade, tariffs, and
nothing like the WTO.
International Telegraphic Union and postal rates and so on. They're signing deals all over the place. And some of them lasted, and some of them are still in force 100 plus years later. But all through history, look, there have been Holy Roman Empires and Catholic leagues and whatnot. There have been all sorts of arrangements that were proved quite vital. I mean, it was the Holy League, I think that was what it was called, to save Europe against the Turks in the 16th century. That was a big deal, but it didn't last. The Charles V, the Habsburg Emperor, had big plans for uniting Europe under the Habsburgs. That didn't last either. Didn't even survive his own lifetime. So in other words, the moment when you get optimistic about these things, that's when, as Hegel called it, the cunning of history comes along and cuts you off at the knees. And I think that's what's going to happen now. And I mean, you've already cited terrorism as a major.
But you know why that is? That's because the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, Jim. Didn't Hegel say that too?
He did say that.
I'm telling you, if you would listen to me at dawn, buddy, we could avoid the coming apocalypse.
But I mean, Hegel's a good illustration of this. Hegel is, somebody who transmuted the religious desire of the Middle Ages, back when Christendom was united, into a kind of secular universalism where what he called the universal class, which is the bureaucracy, would sort of lead the world into progress and so on. So, I think, Bob, you're very much in the Hegelian tradition.
No, actually, well, except that he's in a sense, in terms of how he thinks history works, he's an idealist more like Frank Fukuyama, and I'm more of a materialist like Marx. Maybe that's a technical distinction, but it matters as to how you think what is actually driving the historical process, I think.
Well, no, you're right, and that's a good point. You're a materialist and Hegel's an idealist. That's a fair distinction. But of course, as Marx or Feuerbach or somebody said about Hegel, Marx turned him on his head. And the point is, it's the same either way, whether you're an idealistic determinist or a materialist determinist, you're still sort of assuming that some new thing will come along and change things. That's sort of the common thread through idealism.
The world does have a history of that happening in the form of technological innovation, and in my view, that's the basic driving force. That's what expands the realm of economic and social organization, and that's why governance either catches up or things go badly.
Okay, well, and that's also the same technology gives us A-bombs and,
Exactly.
Well, the point is that if it's so obviously a double-edged sword,
right,
then you can't reach any permanent conclusions about which way it's headed.
Like I said, I'm not really an optimist. I'm just saying that the difference between me and you is not that I'm optimistic and you're pessimistic. The difference is I'm saying if we don't move toward greater degrees of international governance, we go to hell, and you're saying if we do move in that direction, we go to hell. That's a very different...
I think the big difference is you wrote that book and I didn't. And
Well, now what? Now I'm stuck defending it? Buddy, nowhere I'd rather be, believe me.
All right, okay, enough on that.
But enough about this.
I can't have you get too rich just off of me, just like this.
Yeah, I hear that cash register dinging right now. So, what do you... Now, briefly, to get from one of my hobby horses to yours, big news in the world of space today, right?
Big news. The Indians announced they're going to send a rocket to the moon, an unmanned rocket, and what I thought was so striking was that the head of the Indian Space Organization said, well, just bluntly in the New York Times, we have to compete with China. Again, that old devil, national interest and national rivalry, takes new technologies and folds it into the old pattern of national rivalry, which goes back to Carthage versus Rome, and Gog and Magog and everybody else who's ever struggled with each other. So, I mean, again, I think this is where Obama has to be careful, because the Obama administration might be in the grip of global utopians who think we're going to have peace and arms control and non-proliferation. But they're going to discover that there's a world full of people who actively do want to proliferate, who don't seem very interested in keeping their agreements.
Well, of course, the idea behind non-proliferation is that there are people who want to proliferate, and the ideal scheme prevents that.
Well,
but anyway.
but there's this. It may be the case that nobody truly wants to deproliferate. Ukraine and Kazakhstan and stuff like that might have been coerced when they're absolutely on their fannies economically in the 90s to deproliferate, but it is far from clear to me that a dozen countries, from Iran to Japan to South Korea to Taiwan, and probably a residual stam or two, actually aren't going to just wind up with saying, by the way, we have nuclear weapons. What are you going to do about it in the next 5 or 10 years?
Could be, but you would probably... I'm wondering if you would agree that actually it would be in their rational self-interest to favor non-proliferation if the non-proliferation could be assured, right?
Well, that's like saying if everybody else would have lived by Nonzero, I'll live by Nonzero.
Right.
So the point is, I wouldn't think that for a minute.
Well, it's a collective action problem, though. I mean, you do agree that proliferation increases the chances of the apocalypse, right?
Yeah, I do, but I also think that if your neighbor proliferates and you don't, that increases the chances. That much increases the chance of your own neighborhood apocalypse.
Right, that makes it a collective action problem.
Right.
Verifying, getting everyone to agree to it, and verifying their compliance.
And I'm saying nobody will let you do that. No country in their right mind will let themselves be deproliferated. It'll never happen.
Well, I'm saying unless they can really be assured. I grant it's a huge mechanical challenge in how you construct this, how you persuade people. It takes inspirational leadership. It takes the wise construction of these non-proliferation regimes. I'm just saying it actually is in the self-interest of the long-term self-interest of these nations. I don't agree with that.
I think that, look, I'd much rather have a few nukes and no army than a big standing army and have to always be worried whether or not my neighbor built a bigger dreadnought than I did. I think nuclear weapons are much better policy.
Yeah, but you don't think that this is kind of a tangent, that they eliminate the need for conventional forces, right?
I think they drastically reduce them, sure.
Nah, but come on, there are these various kinds of minor incursions that in the real world you're just not going to respond to with a nuclear attack.
Right, and many countries have said we can, the United States being a conspicuous exception, many countries have said, look, we don't care about the minor incursions. I mean, we do care if we're attacked, and if Uzbekistan wants to invade Kyrgyzstan, we don't really care. Now, the Americans do care. We feel obligated to get in there and worry about it, but I think other countries are having tried the American role in the past with unfortunate results over time. I think that especially America was on its own continent. We should be the most to benefit from a big nukes, relatively modest standing army thing, which of course was the American ideal in the first place. American ideal was to always have a small standing army, not a big standing army.
Now, Jim, I gave you an opportunity to ride off on your hobby horse, space exploration, But somehow you turn the conversation back to an attack on my hobby horse, non-proliferation.
Well, thank you. I mean, okay, I don't want to seem like a bad guest, so I will say buy Nonzero. Okay, I got that out of the way, and then I'll go back to my hobby horse, which is space. Which I think but I've always believed that what will lead people into space is military competition. I think when it became clear, 50 years ago or so, that there was actually nothing particularly interesting in terms of Martians and fountains and green cheese and anything else in space that was worth going to harvest or collect or conquer or enslave, then obviously the civilian support for space evaporated, or not evaporated, but collapsed substantially, because the zeal of exploration or discovery was simply not a strong enough force, especially after we put a man on the moon in 1969, to keep support for it at a high level. In which case, the people who do support going to space, and I think who will go there, and they already are the militaries who see enormous strategic objectives in an ambitious space program. And I think the U.S. Pentagon, unless Obama decapitates it, will be very much in that space race, and that's how we'll ultimately get to space with the hope. And my hope is a dozen different countries competing to get the highest, furthest, fastest, mostest.
So you think the militarization of space is a good thing?
I do.
Okay, here's what I don't like about it. I think a lot of people agree that the transparency brought to us by reconnaissance satellites and communication satellites is a stabilizing force in and of itself. So in other words, take India and Pakistan. If they can see with their reconnaissance satellites and be clear on whether the other one actually is launching a nuclear attack, okay, then that tends to exert an inhibiting effect on both of them. Okay, so first of all, you don't have somebody firing off a nuke preemptively in response to what they mistakenly think is a nuclear strike. Secondly, the fact that they know that their own nuclear first launch would be detected tends to discourage them from launching it. So I think it's a fairly widespread view that this kind of transparency is a stabilizing thing. And the trouble with having a bunch of weapons in space is you start rendering these satellites more and more vulnerable, and not only could you actually end the transparency by a lot of them getting shot down, but the fact that it's possible that they could get shot down makes, like India and Pakistan, edgy, and it makes them more likely to interpret a temporary outage or something as an enemy attack and do something crazy. That's what I don't like.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're exactly right. But it's like, again, it's back to nuclear weapons. Look, it'd be great if we had a verifiable world where nobody had nuclear weapons. But we don't, and we never will. And it would be great if we had a verifiable world where nobody has space weapons. But we don't, and we never will. So all you can do is deal with these cruel, negative sum cards we're being dealt all the time, and play them the best you can.
Jim, you got a really grim worldview, man.
I don't.
Who is this woman you found who would marry you and listen to this stuff night after night? I mean, it's not too late for... Tell her there's a way out.
I think that it's never too late or never too early for history-based realism. I think we need a lot more of that. A friend of mine, Mike Vallejos at the Johns Hopkins Advanced Physics Lab, just wrote a book about sort of military history, and I wrote a blurb for it, and I just made the point that if more politicians read history, we wouldn't be repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And the same thing applies to military history. Military history is pretty decisive on this. If you're weak, you will get conquered. Period.
Well, it seems to me once you get to a point... The funny thing is you accept, I think, the premise that these various proliferations of nuclear weapons, space weapons, do really up the chances of the apocalypse, but you don't share my view that, well, that means that, however uphill a battle it is to rein them in, maybe we should give some serious thought to doing that.
Well, I think what we should do is settle other planets.
Yeah, I know, but that's just not, for Joe the plumber, that's just not, Joe the plumber ain't going to be on your spaceship, Jim, and most Americans aren't.
Well, someday that could change. I mean, for example, in Japan...
Well, once he starts his own business, he'll, of course, be able to afford...
Japan which is a country that I think still has vast ambitions, has recently announced plans to build a space elevator. A space elevator is a 100-mile cable from here to orbiting a stationary satellite, and it's really pretty.
Wow.
Technically, it's an idea that was thought of by the Russian astronomer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in like the late 1890s, and it would reduce the cost of lifting material into space by like 99.9%. Because you'd be winching it up a carbon filament tether or whatever material they ultimately come up with that entire period of time. It'd just be like crawling up a rope ladder. And at that point, all the sort of admittedly impossible economics of lifting things through chemical rockets go out the window. At which point, space becomes a snap. And this is exactly the sort of technology that America should have been pioneering from 50 years ago on. And if we'd been doing that, we'd probably be pretty close to achieving it now. And now I'm afraid that Japan is going to be the first one to do this, and maybe the only one to do this. In which case, Japan, or wherever they put it in Japan, will become the boom city of boom cities in the 21st century. And at that point, all bets are off in terms of what's possible in terms of space exploration and space travel and the relocation of population.
Well, one more word on the weaponization of space is that the longer we insist we can't head off the weaponization of space, the harder it gets. And a good example is that Chinese anti-satellite weapons test, what, a year ago or so? Everyone in the policy community seems to think that before that happened, China would have been amenable to a treaty prohibiting the testing of anti-satellite weapons. And before they've tested one, they don't have much confidence in it, and it's much less likely to be used, and so on. But now, by not taking advantage of that long period of time when we had the advantage in anti-satellite weapons and could have probably gotten an enforceable ban on the testing of them, by not taking advantage of that, we've made it that much harder.
I don't believe that for a minute.
I know, but
I really don't. I think the Chinese would do ASAT as soon as they figured out they knew how to do it, and that's that.
It's hard to test that thesis when people like George Bush don't propose a treaty and don't take advantage. I mean, what have you lost? We weren't testing weapons anyway.
It's hard to test the League of Nations until you get Hitler, and then you do get a test. And you see how it works.
Yeah, you learn something, and actually the UN's a little better than the League of Nations.
The UN is totally paralyzed now. The UN will never do a thing again for as long as it exists, and I'll tell you why. Because the Russians and the Chinese, as two members of the Security Council, are never going to agree to what we want them to. That's a matter of their own national policy.
Some non-trivial things actually have gotten past the Security Council. The authorization of the Persian Gulf War, which rolled back aggression.
Not now that Russia is back.
Well, sanctions against Iran.
I'm sorry?
Sanctions against Iran.
They're not meaningful sanctions. The Russians are doing business with Iran right and left.
Look, I agree that the structure of the UN is pretty screwed up by single-nation veto and lots of other things. But again, when it's hard to say during this period, again, getting back to post 9/11, I think in principle a lot of reforms of international institutions would have been possible right after 9/11. We had exactly the wrong guy in office. We'll never know. You could do meaningful UN reform, but it ain't happening under Bush. It ain't happening under McCain. Maybe there's a prayer under Obama, but anyway, I guess the difference.
So you're probably for the Law of the Sea Treaty too.
Oh, I actually haven't given that much thought. Sounds great though.
Again, there's one where we'll see whether Obama. That'll be an early test. I should have put that in my 6-month category. Mm-hmm. If Obama really thinks that the world has changed, that he's going to change the tone of Washington, that he's going to change the world, change everybody, change everything, then sure, why not submit the Law of the Sea Treaty, which I predict will be a Panama Canal-like fight in terms of rallying conservatives who say, listen, we're just not going to give away our oceans or the oceans to international bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, my final thought on world governance, and to which you can reply, that both concedes your point that progress is erratic at best, and yet argues that there's a place for a very hard-headed kind of global governance, and that there has been net progress, is the World Trade Organization. At the moment, it's stymied. things seem to be going no further. Maybe that means we need to reform the decision-making process, the ratification process, whatever. On the other hand, I would say that when it's worked over the last 10 years or so, and it has sometimes, what you've seen is an adjudicatory body decides that one nation's tariffs are, or subsidies or whatever, are illegal under international law, and the aggrieved nation is then authorized to levy punitive sanctions. That has, in many cases, worked more or less well, and that's not a revolutionary thing. When this did not exist under GATT, the precursor of the WTO, there was no enforcement mechanism at all. And finally, I would just say, aren't you, I mean, as a free trader, don't you kind of like the idea that when there's a violation of trade, there in principle could be a body you could turn to rather than letting the thing dissolve into a trade war?
I don't remember when I was called a free trader.
You're not a free trader?
I think of myself as sort of a Hamiltonian.
Were you never, ever?
I was more free trade, and then it dawned on me that the good works of the WTO are, we traded away our industries, which we sent to China, for the right to sell, for AIG to sell insurance in China. And I think now looking back at it, that was kind of a bad deal. Okay.
Well, do you want to talk a little party realignment?
Sure. Let's talk party realignment.
I mean, what do you think?
What theory do you have there, Bob?
I think I want to see the permanent ascendancy of the one world party, Jim. But I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So instead, I just think it's kind of interestingly mixed up. And your man Huckabee was part of the mixing up, right? He's a Republican, but he's an economic populist. So, and if you listen to the way Sarah Palin talks, in a way you have a similar thing. She's the religious right, like Huckabee. She is talking economic populist, although who isn't in this election? But still, and yet that traditional, meanwhile, you have a kind of desertion of the Republican Party by some of its traditional elites, right? I mean, you got basically, but not just Silicon Valley money, but Wall Street, by and large, on the Obama bandwagon, right? The money... and Wall Street used to be a source of Republican funding. Am I right?
It's been Democratic it's been trending Democratic for a long time, but certainly, if you go back far enough, it was certainly a Republican bastion. Yes.
So, and this I think was a subtext of kind of this, or maybe the text of this David Brooks column when he was complaining about Palin. I think he was kind of saying, look, if the Republican Party consists fundamentally of the religious right with a heavy anti-intellectual tinge, and the anti-intellectualism is so heavy that basically elites of all stripes, including everyone with money, moves to the Democratic Party, and especially if the Democratic Party continues to hang on to some of the economic issues that lower income people like, well, how big can the Republican base be, right? That's kind of the question he was asking.
Well, I think, look, it's actually fairly standard in history for the overclass and the underclass to be in the same party against the middle class. That's a pretty standard arrangement. And so the Democratic Party of George Soros and Al Sharpton makes perfect sense. They both agree that the middle class needs to be controlled and defeated.
But the Republicans don't have the middle class on board in a big enough way.
You're right. Not right today. They don't. In part because I think they're sort of they did foolish things like support this bailout, which is wildly unpopular, and I think is not going to work out well, and is an enormous transfer of wealth from, the heartland to New York City. And as long as Republicans are mesmerized by stupid ideas of somehow that what Paulson proposed had anything to do with the free market, I think it was much more reminiscent of what the Russian oligarchs were doing in Russia in the post-Soviet era, just simply stealing assets from the country and putting in their own pockets. As long as Republicans define that as good economics, then why should the middle class support them? But one day the Republicans will wake up and say, listen, it is no longer our idea of a good economic policy to give $100 billion in new fees. I did the calculations based on a Wall Street Journal article earlier this month that noted that the exact same firms that got us into this mess on the financial crisis are the ones who are going to be the people handling in the future. And I just saw in the paper today or on the wire that Price Waterhouse and Ernst & Young are going to be the accounting firms for this. In other words, the exact same people, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, whoever, who presided over this catastrophe are now going to collect, probably 1% a year in fees and consulting contracts and so on like that. 1% of $1 trillion is 10 billion times 10 is 100 billion. So we're going to give them $100 billion and more money as a reward for failure. Now, what's striking is that the Democrats are pretty much agreed on the bailout. Obama and the Democratic congressional leadership and the bulk of Democrats in Congress. The only sort of flicker of opposition came from the House Republicans and a few heroes in the Senate like Richard Shelby of Alabama. These are the ones who at least said, look, this is in dollar terms probably the biggest ripoff in history, and we shouldn't vote for it. Yeah, and McCain and Bush and Paulson and to their discredit, the many Republicans in Congress voted for it. Well, so in other words, Bob, I think that the realignment is coming. I think that the middle class will eventually wake up and realize that this kind of policy is inimical to them. I will agree with David Brooks this far, though, and that is that the Republican Party, if it's ever going to regain the majority in Congress and quite possibly regain the presidency, assuming that Obama wins, will obviously need an intelligent theory that explains what's going on. And I think that theory will be much closer to Hamilton than anything else, if there is to be one. And Hamilton is infrastructure, rebuilding, solid middle class. The American system, as Henry Clay called it, that's a legitimate theory which has deep roots in American history, which actually was pretty much the dominant tradition in American politics through the 1970s. And it sort of went away and sort of evaporated by libertarians and environmentalists in the 80s and 90s who sort of agreed on no public works and no nothing and free trade. So I do think that the Obama Democratic coalition, which sort of assumes that the middle class will sit still for free trade, globalism, and bailouts for Wall Street, is more temporary than it looks right now, according to the polls.
Well, I think first of all, in the Wall Street bailout thing, that was like almost everybody in Washington just being deer in the headlights. I mean, in other words, just caught up in a crisis and like, what do we do? I think as it's happened, the bailout, so-called bailout, as adapted, right? Originally, it was this asset buyout program, bad asset buyout program, and then it was morphed into this capital injection into banks program coordinated with Europe. In that form, it is currently being credited with many by having stopped the descent into chaos. So I don't know how that'll play out, but I'm not sure that bailing out Wall Street is like a permanent, a deeply rooted fixture of Obamaism. But anyway,
I think Bob. I mean, look who the Obama administration is. It's Warren Buffett. It's Bob Rubin. It's where he's the one who's gotten all his money from Wall Street and hedge funds and stuff like that. And I think what you're seeing now is we're proving, and not that it's any great shock, that if you print a bunch of money and fabricate a bunch of money out of the Federal Reserve, that you can prop up stock prices. I could do that too. I could make every stockholder, 1,000 shares worth $1 million. I just printed enough money to do it. I think this is going to lead to the bubble of bubbles down the road somewhere. Maybe after Obama's left the presidency after 4 or 8 years, if he in fact does win in November. But this is not the same as a strong economy. We've had an experiment with both parties have signed on to that will say that American wealth consists of putting a bank branch on every street corner, sending everybody 10 credit card applications in the mail, 1 or 2 of which they might sign and submit for, and then watching everybody's house balloon in value by 10% a year for 3 or 4 decades. And that the theory was that equals wealth. And in a paper sense it does, but in a real sense of enduring strength and power for a country, it doesn't. And I think that's the collision that we're going to come up with when we wake up and realize, how come we can't build a tank that can withstand an IED in Iraq? How come we can't make our own energy? How come we can't build a space elevator? I mean, those are the things that really make you strong long term. And as far as I can tell, both parties in their current leadership modes of Bush and Obama and McCain have no plan for doing anything.
So let me get clear on what you see as the future coalition of your dreams. Let's assume, which I'm not assuming, that McCain loses. But if he does lose, there will be, an orgy of recriminations and finger pointing, and there will be different ideas about what the new coalition should be. What coalition, elaborate a little on what you want to see emerge as the new Republican coalition. Sounds like basically you want the middle class, you want to give the Democrats real low-income people, right? Like poor people, maybe. Right. And you'll let them have the elites, both the cultural elites and the financial elites, right?
Because they're already together. They've already formed an alliance. They control both parties. They should only control one.
But you also imagine a pretty religiously oriented Republican Party. I mean, you were a Huckabee advisor and
still a fan.
Okay, so
no,
how much of the middle class can you hang on to?
I think that the sources of legitimacy in a country, come from, as Martin Luther said, we should be lit by the light of faith and by the light of reason, both. And I think that our obviously a lot of our culture, I think, inevitably will, and I personally think should be inflected with a strong degree of faith and respect for tradition and respect for religious heritage.
But a lot of middle-class people are not very religious, and a number are actual atheists or agnostics, right?
Fair enough, and they said respect for, and the realization that the social capital that a country needs, the parents who stay married and raise their children and stuff like that, will inevitably have a substantial faith component to it. But I agree. There's nothing in this that should be invidious to agnostics or atheists.
Okay, so you want blue-collar and white-collar middle class dominated by the Republican Party,
right?
And you want a somewhat economically nationalist program, right?
Right, which by the way is the program that wins in most democracies around the world. I mean, if you look all across Europe and Japan, it's center-right nationalist parties that are doing this.
And then,
and I think that's the other point is that the light of reason, as Luther said, we should be respectful of the Constitution. I think one of my pet projects is to make the War Powers Act, which was an act by Congress in 1973. And no president has ever respected it and turned that into a constitutional amendment. Let's give it some real teeth. Let's actually say that the Congress really means it when it says if you want to start a war, you have to get us to declare war first. That hasn't been done by any Congress since 1941 with President Roosevelt. And I think that it would be very important to restore the checks and balances system, including the Article 1, which makes it really clear that when it comes to war fighting, it's the Congress, not the executive, that has real authority. So this has been a constitutional principle that the founders knew exactly what they were doing back in the 18th century when they wrote all this, and they said we don't want another George III getting us into silly foreign wars on a whim. We want it to be difficult to do this, and unfortunately in recent decades we've made it sort of easy for a president to get us into trouble. And I think that would be a major component would be a restoration of constitutionals. Now, some things, of course, again, back to Obama, if Obama says he wants to have a law of the sea treaty, well, that'll be a middle-class galvanizing fight. If Obama says he wants to do anything on cap and trade, he wants to shut the U.S. economy down in the name of polar bears, when in fact the world seems to be getting cooler, according to the latest things I was just reading in the Canadian newspapers. Those are the fights that will just turn like that. Will remind middle and working class Americans, and for that matter the poor, and a good chunk of the rich too, that wow, we really can't afford to sell out our country to some left utopian vision.
Okay, so yeah, speaking of which, so the foreign policy you would like to see associated with your new Republican coalition is, on the one hand, more restrained militarily than the Bush administration was during its first 4 years, certainly. Or Clinton, good, and a number of lefties are on board with you there, but you don't want to go with the nurturing of multilateral institutions that these same lefties want.
Right.
So, and okay, does that foreign policy then really grow organically out of the coalition you're describing, or is it more the case that really no foreign policy ever grows organically out of any coalition, and it's just a question of what foreign policy you can kind of attach to a coalition?
No, I think that ordinary Americans do not, as a general rule, sit around worrying about democracy in Afghanistan. They have surprisingly narrow views about what the reach of American power. Now, if you get them into a war and they want to fight and they want to win, But on the whole, the seductions of foreign policy are that here between New York and Washington is where you have whole buildings dedicated to worrying about Africa and Asia and the Middle East and Europe and everything like that. And that's an elite phenomenon. You go get a PhD somewhere and you do a stint at the State Department or someplace or some think tank, and now all of a sudden you spend the rest of your life agitating to quote do more unquote, for Madagascar or Bolivia or wherever else around the world it is. And that's, I think, where trouble lies.
Well, of course, but my view is that on grounds of strict national self-interest, as history marches on and the world is more intertwined, on grounds of strict national interest, you have to take more of an interest in the outcome of events abroad. That doesn't mean that every humanitarian intervention is justified on national interest by any means, but you understand my argument for multilateral kind of evolution is grounded in American self-interest, and you and I just disagree over whether...
Bob, I'm not against multilaterals. I'm not against efforts. I'm not against the efforts by the presidents in the 1920s to limit the size of ships. I mean, some of this might be doable. Mm-hmm. Your point's well taken about satellites and the value of satellites. I mean, there's and therefore, if we all agreed on an international regime of satellite observation for arms control deals, and one country broke it for some reason or started shooting down satellites, that would obviously be a signal to the rest of the world. No, I think that alliances are fine, and I think that but I think you got to have in your back pocket the realization that the Chinese start shooting down satellites that this is we need to be immediately ready to take action. Mm-hmm. If the Chinese and the Russians and whoever else are willing to work within that system and they see in their interest in doing so. I mean, the pessimist in me, or the realist in me, says they probably won't over the long run. But by all means, let's do it as long as we can.
Okay.
So I think that the foreign policy that I would like to see is basically based on American national interests, broadly thought through, and then alliances with like-minded countries that choose to be allies with it. But what I don't think works very well is, and I think NATO did work, for example, because everybody in Europe pretty much understood they didn't want the Soviets to conquer them. I think by now, NATO is pretty much sort of an alliance in search of a mission, and now it's getting itself into trouble. And I don't think that, for example, intervention in most places in the world meets the test of Americans' national interest.
I certainly agree that one comes to mind, and the recent intervention that has that. We agree on a lot of that stuff. Okay, I'll basically give you the last word, especially since there was kind of a little bit of drift in the direction of my worldview. I want to end it right there. But we'll see. 2 weeks from tonight, we'll know more about America's future than we do now. We'll know whether you're. We'll start thinking about the prospects in the event of an Obama victory, for your new Republican coalition, and you can come back and talk.
I'll give you an example of how it's going to come to pass fast. Mm-hmm. Does Barack Obama still support driver's licenses for illegal aliens?
I'll bet you he finesses that.
Okay, maybe he does. Maybe he does. But I recall for you that Eliot Spitzer, the former governor of New York, tried to pass a driver's license for illegals thing in New York State, and in a blue state got himself clobbered.
Yeah, of course he made a subsequent mistake.
He made a subsequent mistake,
and I predict that Barack Obama will not do that.
Obama seems like a fine man personally. I have no criticism as an individual, but if his ideology tells him that he has to support a plan which is abhorrent to the middle class sensibilities in this country, on forget driver's license, let's go to health care. And to do all this without building a fence first, I think that's the compromise that's waiting to be had, is you build a fence and then you deal with the population in this country. But until you build a fence, you just obviously can't run the welfare state for the world. And I don't think that, and the evidence is pretty strong in this, considering what happened in California, that it will be possible to enact a health care plan for America, which I support in some form or fashion, until you have satisfied people that illegals won't get it.
Okay.
And so if Obama is willing to subscribe to middle class sensibilities on that issue, then he might well have an extremely successful presidency.
Yeah.
But he would only have a successful presidency if he annoys the lefties, who I think are his base of support.
Okay. Well, one big question will be, to what degree do we see assimilation of existing immigrants, and to what extent do we see ongoing immigration? I can certainly imagine that could be one of the catalysts for realignment.
Right.
let's
we can end it there, Bob.
let's end it there and talk more sometime not too long after the election.
I'll look forward to it.
Okay, thanks,
Thanks for
Jim.
having me.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.